Why name a podcast Wi-Fi Water? It's a great question, and I hope to shed more light on this today. I'm your host, Jarrett Carpenter, and this is Wi-Fi Water. Wi-Fi is all around us. It's oftentimes the first thing we ask for after flying thousands of miles and taking a week or two off to escape. Excuse me, what's the Wi-Fi password? This isn't an uncommon question when arriving to a hotel, hostel, resort, or even a friend's house. I mean, why burn your data when you can use their Wi-Fi, right? It's become such a part of our society that bars can be known as radical for not having it and replacing it with signs like, no Wi-Fi, please talk to your friends or talk with a stranger. Wi-Fi connects us to the internet, aka the digital world. It's what allows us to do our online banking, watch Tiger King on Netflix, turn our home TVs from around 2008, 2009 into smart TVs, and watch old highlights of Messi. But maybe that's just me. Wi-Fi allows us to do a million things. And it even allows me to record this and probably you to listen to this podcast, especially if you're at home or at a friend's house or at a bar or anywhere that has Wi-Fi. It's become so essential to our world that not having it can even create a more widening gap of inequality, especially as education goes more online. Just imagine the single parent who can barely make the rent, groceries, and pay for the utilities, never mind the cable internet bill. In the information age, information is a currency, and not having access to it won't allow you to compete at the same level as someone who does. But before we go down the inequities in access to the internet and Wi-Fi, let's look at water. Water, where to start? Without it, we would just die. It's the single most important resource on the planet, and for many of us in the US, if that's where you're listening from, we never stop to think about it. It's hardly ever turned off, and all we have to do is walk to our faucet, turn it on, go to the shower, turn it on. It's something we really just don't think about. We never even stop to calculate our daily, weekly, monthly, and then annual usage. It's one of the biggest things we take for granted in our daily lives. On a more personal level, it's one of the biggest differences between the United States and almost every place I've ever traveled to. People are a lot more water conscious. It's a lot more in the conversation. And especially when you travel in the Americas and Central and South America, due to the agricultural strength of many of these places and the subsistence farming, it's just a lot more of a conversation. So I don't really know what else to say about water, and I'm going to leave the diatribe related to water usage for another entire episode. And for now, let's just say that it's a need that we often conflate and intertwine with life's wants, like our pools, fancy cars, the need to wash our fancy cars, etc. The importance of these two items can really be summed up by two films from the nearly half-century running fictitious series James Bond. And yes, I'm going to bring up James Bond on episode 2 of the podcast. Now, when I think of James Bond, I think of a couple things. One, I think of GoldenEye. I am not good at video games, and GoldenEye was maybe the only video game I was ever good at. And I was only ever good at it when I used the Game Shark cheat code at my cousin's house when I was about 9 or 10 or whenever N64 came out, and I would have the golden gun. Number one. Number two, it reminded me of the high school epic conversations that we would have when TNT or TBS would run the Bond Marathon, and I would get in with it with one of my neighbors, a childhood neighbor growing up named Ian, and we would argue about who was better, Roger Moore and Sean Connery. Now, I think I was pro Sean Connery and he was pro Roger Moore, or maybe it was the other way around, but either way, it was a childhood debate that existed before smartphones, Wi-Fi, and the internet, and so it was a lot of just opinion, which was beautiful. You remember those conversations back in the bar where we would say, oh, who was better, so-and-so or so-and-so in this season, you know, in the Premiership or in La Liga or in the NBA or in any sport, and we had no way to actually look up data right in our hand. Now those conversations don't happen as much. And if they do, I don't know. They're never as fun as they once were. And three, finally, the ridiculousness or potential genius of the series' films and plots. I mean, in Moonraker, they literally are fighting over the dominance of the moon, and here we are in 2020, Donald Trump now has a space force. That happened. So today I want to focus on two of the series' films, plots that I think are really ridiculous when I first heard about them, but now they make the most sense in the world. The first one will be Tomorrow Never Dies, which came out in 1997, and Quantum of Solace, which came out in 2008. Now, in Tomorrow Never Dies, Pierce Brosnan is basically taking on, Pierce Brosnan as James Bond is taking on Elliot Carver, who's played by Jonathan Pryce. And Jonathan Pryce is a media mogul baron, so think of like Roger Ailes, who is trying to start essentially a war between England and China. And as a media mogul and baron, he will have exclusive rights to this, and then he'll be able to basically dictate the war. And if he can dictate the world war, then he'll be the ruler of the world. Now, at the time, a 10-year-old me just said, that's ridiculous. How could controlling the media lead to national, regional, or even world dominance? But I was 10 years old. Media wasn't where it is today. There wasn't Twitter. There wasn't Facebook. You can go through all the lists of social media that there wasn't. I don't even think there was MySpace, for those of you who remember that was. So that movie really talked about the power of media, and it put it in a Bond villain, like that's a way to take over the world, and I didn't understand. So then let's jump ahead 11 years, and Quantum of Solace comes out. And now Daniel Craig is playing James Bond, and the bad guy in this movie is played by Dominic Green, or Matthew Almeric. He's a French actor and filmmaker. And his whole thing is he's in Bolivia, and he's trying to take control of the water. Why does he want to take control of the water? Because if he takes control of the water, or if he takes control of the land that owns the water, i.e. the water, then he'll be able to control the government vis-a-vis the power of the military. Also, once again, I was in 2008. I was in college. I was 21, 22. I didn't understand the importance of water. So 97, as a little kid, I didn't understand the power of media. And in 2008, I still didn't really grasp the importance of water. And I think because I didn't have any life experience with that. You know, life in the United States had always been turn the faucet off, turn the faucet on, turn the faucet on, turn the faucet off. And sometimes maybe in the summer we'd have to be a little bit more, there would be like a water ban, so we couldn't wash our car, we couldn't, water the lawn. But on the most part, it was never an issue in my life. So we'll fast forward to 2010, and I'm in the Peace Corps in Guatemala. And I was sent there with 45 other gringos, or, people from the United States to volunteer. The program I was assigned to was Healthy Schools. And I'm sure now with, my ability to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and a lot more of another lexicon with international development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I could probably speak about it in a lot more of an eloquent manner. But the reality of it is I was sent out to villages to help school faculty help the children improve washing their hands and brushing their teeth. I wish it sounded more sexier. I wish it sounded sexier, but that's the truth of the matter. Most Peace Corps volunteers go to do very mundane things. Now, it's not going to be what they say on their resume or what's on their LinkedIn, but that's the truth. And that, at the end of the day, is normally what needs the most support. Complex things can be solved by simple solutions. That's not the world I think they raise us in this technology where everyone has to write code to solve the world, but many complex things can be solved by simple solutions. So in the Peace Corps, each day was an absolute true adventure. And it's really hard to sum up my 26-month experience in Guatemala in the Healthy Schools programs. But one of the main takeaways that I took, obviously, friendships and other amazing experiences. And I still have people I consider family down in Guatemala. But what I really took home, one of the biggest lessons I took home was the importance of water. And it was extremely difficult, nearing impossible, to increase the daily habit of washing one's hands and brushing one's teeth if you don't have water, not to mention survive. So as I started to spend more time in these communities and even live out in these communities, as some of them were farther away, so I would have to spend a week at a time out there, seeing how people had to navigate the daily hunt for water will forever have changed my experience around water. Many of the communities where I worked at the time when I arrived didn't have running water or electricity. And so before we could even jump into the bureaucratic and kitchen curriculum that I had been sent with, which is kind of influenced from Washington, but really just that had been built up over years and years of volunteers in the Healthy Schools program, we almost had to kind of dive in head first. And this is at a time where my Spanish is not where it is today. I'm out in a community where there are cultural beliefs that, like, if you're a bad behaving child, the gringo will take you. There were a bunch of things in play. I'm a Colombian also. I was born in Colombia, so I'm not blonde hair, blue eyed, and like 6'6". There was a lot of things in play, but I basically went into these communities, and one of the first things we had to start to do was to really start to petition local NGOs to help get some of their money, NGOs would be in there from the States, and we ended up working with an NGO that had money coming in from a church, I believe from Texas, and we leveraged some of that money, some of the community's labor, and some of the local municipal money, and we were able to do water projects. And the water projects were amazing, and it was great to see how people would rally around that, because they were basically, they were putting in their labor, which is their time. The municipality would put in some mason workers and some rocks, some cement, and some other things that we need, and then all the other materials that we would need would be bought with the money that I was able to get from nonprofits in the States. But it was amazing to see how these communities were transformed with just having water so the kids could, wash their hands and brush their teeth. The next step beyond that would obviously be finding a way to filter it so that way they could drink it. Once again, that's an entirely different topic about water, but it's important to never dawned on me probably before I went to Guatemala, and that's an extremely privileged thing to say. And I think for maybe one of you or some of you or any of you who are listening to this, maybe you have a similar experience where you realize the importance of water. And then so circling back, I leave. So actually fast forwarding a little bit. So I leave Guatemala in 2012. I go to Colombia. I'm there until 2013. And then when I come out of Colombia and I move to New York for grad school, there's this thing called Twitter. And I didn't know what Twitter was. I didn't know what a tweet was. I just didn't understand it. There's also this thing called the iPhone. Now, the iPhone came out, I believe, in the fall of 2007, the first iPhone. And so during the end of the time of my college career, no one really had it. We still had flip phones, still had like the Motorola Razor. And then the 3 years that I was in the Peace Corps, so it was almost 3.5 because there was some time in the middle there between both of my experiences in Guatemala and Colombia. The world had sped up and the world had gotten closer, and social media was all of a sudden booming. There was Instagram, there was Twitter, Facebook was starting to turn more into the giant that it is today, and the world was moving at 1,000 miles per hour. So I very quickly understood, leaving the Peace Corps, the power of Wi-Fi, media, connectivity, information, and water. And so those things have been motifs and themes throughout, I think, most of my adult life, from basically leaving college onward. And so when I wanted to come up with this podcast, and I've been wanting to, basically get my blog back up, but I figured a podcast would be easier because I can just kind of talk. I'm not going to edit this. If it's awkward, it is. We're just going to throw it up. But water and Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi and water, for that matter, are everywhere. They're literally everywhere. And so taking that even into the last couple of years, I've seen it with the Keystone Pipeline. I mean, these are people who are indigenous to the United States who are fighting for their land because they want to put a pipeline upriver, which if it were to break, and it did, it would basically contaminate their water source. They were literally fighting for their lives. We have Flint, Michigan, still doesn't have water that they can drink, and it has caused many, many problems, which also ties into racism and Black Lives Matter, which I will talk about probably in the next episode. But many of those communities are not getting the backing that they should from local, regional, national government, because they're communities of color. They're indigenous communities or they're Black communities. So Wi-Fi and water, it really is a ubiquitous thing that I hope to encompass a lot of things on this podcast. I don't think it's going to be a niche podcast, and I know that's what you're supposed to do, but I'm hoping to create content and to have guests on that will talk about a myriad of different things. And some week it will make sense to you to listen, and other weeks it won't. And other weeks you'll be like, oh, I don't know about that, but I'd like to learn. And then coming full force, all the way up from Tomorrow Never Dies in 1997 with this fictitious guy named Elliot Carver, then we have the rise of Breitbart, and Fox News gets even more, into fake news, as it were. They admitted today, it was a New York Times article, and I'm recording this on the 14th of June. They admitted today to having doctored images. So it fit their narrative. And from Fox News, people have been complaining about Fox News being extremely conservative, right-wing, and, even authoritarian for years in the way that they talk about immigrants, the way they talk about the LGBT community, the way they talk about basically marginalized communities. And, we have to be we have to keep our eye out for the next thing, because the next thing is the OAN, and the President of the United States is already using Twitter, full circle with Twitter, to spread conspiracy theories that OAN is publishing. And OAN could potentially be, should Donald Trump win in 2020, it could be his essentially, kind of hand in glove media, where they tweet what he says and vice versa. He tweets what they say, because that's kind of the relationship they've had with Fox. But Fox is a little bit more moderate when it comes when it's compared to OAN. And you have the rise of misinformation and fake news on levels I don't think we've ever seen. In the last year, I can't even tell you how many times I've seen people on Facebook and on Instagram or on a WhatsApp feed or whatever it is, so the medium of sharing information, share something that was just actually not factually backed up. It was not based in fact. It wasn't peer reviewed. It was someone's opinion, and it was just put out there on the internet. And I think it's an extremely dangerous thing. So Tomorrow Never Dies, 1997, with the idea of controlling media to control the world. And then Quantum of Solace, 2008, and controlling water to control the world. I think those things are full circle, and I think in the future, people will be fighting. There will be wars, world wars or regional wars fought not over oil, but fought over land that is tied intrinsically to water, or just fought over bodies of water. That is the future. And so I gave the name to the podcast, Wi-Fi and Water, because I just think it's so ubiquitous. And when you walk into a bar in the United States, there's normally two things. There's the Wi-Fi password, and when you sit down at a table, there's a little thing that has the Wi-Fi password, and there's water. And so that's where we are. It's all around us, and I think it's really important that we understand how those two things play a role in everything. Whether it's the Wi-Fi getting us to, Wi-Fi connecting us, and water giving us life. So next time you're in a bar and they have Wi-Fi and water, think about us. That's going to be all for this episode. If you have any questions, or if you want to be a guest, please DM us at Wi-Fi and Water Podcast on Instagram. Thanks.